get people set down and we can go live on YouTube. So ladies and gentlemen, Senator Scott is still making his way down here, but he was right behind us, I guarantee you. So I think I know there's been a lot happening. I know that the Public Service Commission has been working. We got through testimony of the Public Service Commission, the OCA, and the Department of Environmental Quality the other day. So, and here comes Senator Scott now, so my plan worked perfectly then. So Senator Scott, we were just deciding what to do next. We heard from the public agencies and yourself last time. I was going to open it up for public testimony unless you have a preferred way to go forward.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we do need to hear public testimony, particularly from utility involved. And
okay. All right, let's just go ahead with public testimony. Who would like to be first? This is exciting.
testimony. I think that's my cue.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Please introduce yourself. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Case, members of the committee. My name is Richard Garlish. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel for Rocky Mountain Power.
You're the guy.
Yeah, I'm the guy, yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and be before the committee today. This is part of a conversation I view has been going on for quite some time. Senator Scott, I appreciate his leadership bringing us together over the summer for several meetings to have some very open and very candid conversations about CCUS and the Dave Johnston plant and what makes sense going forward. And while we disagree on some things, but I think we understand that, you know, it's the goal of the state of Wyoming and the company's share goal to find a way to have a CCUS project that makes sense for Wyoming and our customers and the utility. And, you know, from that perspective, as we look at it as a company, nobody's done more to try to advance CCUS in the country than Wyoming through the legislature's leadership and the governor's leadership. We have incentives like the $82 million that's available from the governor's office. We have HB 200 and Senate File 159. Senate File 159 imposes some accountability on the company to be responsible moving forward, as does HB 200. But HB 200 also sets forth a workable process to find the right project that makes sense for Wyoming in terms of advancing the technology and for customers. And I think it's important to note that we are talking about advancing the technology. Sometimes we tend to gloss over what's involved with a retrofit of a 40-year-old plant. These are billion-dollar projects. You know, a retrofit is not, you know, it might be a poor analogy, but, you know, we're not talking about putting mud flaps on a car. We're talking about, you know, putting a sophisticated turbocharger on a 50-year-old vehicle. And, you know, how that works from an operational perspective, a technical perspective, and a financial perspective is all new, and the technology is new. And so what 200 has done for us is it's given us that process to work and solicit bids from folks that are in the CO2 business and the sequestration business and the technology business that we are not, to try to find people that can come forward with a project that will make sense for us and our customers that we can do and adhere with the law. And in terms of where we are in that process, we are, you know, more than midway through, I'd say, in going through what's available and being out there. So it doesn't feel, I understand, like progress, but in the utility world where everything moves slow, it's actually a significant amount of process to go from, you know, zero to where we are now, taking bids, doing site walkthroughs, and getting ready to do the analysis about what comes next is a fair amount of progress. But I understand that that's not everybody's view of progress. But we feel it is significant progress, and that's been the result of the incentives and accountability in SF 159 and HB 200. So, you know, this has been our kind of discussion we've had all summer. You know, I feel like the company has obligations under the laws that's passed, 200 and 159, but also we voluntarily made the commitment in the 10th Circuit settlement on Jim Bridger to pursue a CCUS project. So, you know, we are at the table, we are accountable. We've pledged as the company to support the all of the above strategy. We are doing that with our transmission investments, our renewable investments, and also what we're putting into the Kemmer Advanced Nuclear. And we view this as part of that process of how we take our infrastructure in this changing environment and figure out how to leverage it and move forward. The company's been here for 100 years. We want to be here for 100 more. We've put billions of dollars into the state, even recently. The Gateway West transmission project is an example of that. Understand the frustration of not moving fast as some of the people would like to see us on this project, but I don't think it's accurate to say that we are not working to make progress and that there is a risk that the company is going to walk away. It's not in our interest to walk away from the state when we have many, many commitments, financial and otherwise, to the state. So that's the 200 side. But with this bill, you take all that, and then another important piece is the IRA. That has had an impact on who's participating in the RFP. There are lots of federal dollars available over a longer period of time. So we're just starting to see how all that's coming together. And I do think we're getting closer to seeing what projects are available in Wyoming that make sense. So, if you look at this bill, the question comes down from a CCUS perspective. Is this going to enhance the environment, the work that the legislature and the governor have already done to start a process and end up in a place that has a project? Or is it going to slow it down and stop it? And from our perspective, we feel like it's going to slow it down and stop it because it introduces another whole entire process that conflicts with 200 and 159. And I understand there's any number of amendments that the PSC has and others that may have that might address some of that, but I don't know what they're amending because it's not the process. It's just going to be another process on top of an existing process that'll force us to try to figure out how to comply with it in the PSC and the OCA and others, how to comply at the same time as we're trying to finish what we started. So we're strongly in support of letting 200 and 159 move forward. Now, that's not to say that we're opposed to more incentives, of course, or more accountability, but we think it's a wiser thing to execute this process that 200 and 159 have given us, measure where we are, and then if there's more incentives or more accountability that need to happen, that it comes based on informed information that actually is based on what the market is telling us about what's available for this project. So that's the CCUS side of this. But I'm not sure that that's what this bill is about. I'm not really sure it's about putting CCUS on a power plant or if it's about finding mechanisms to capture CO2 to do an advanced oil recovery and those activities. So that's not my business. I'm not in that business. I don't know much about it. I do know that the power plant is not the only source of CO2 available. My understanding there is other CO2 that's available around the Dave Johnston area that could be piped in to do some of these activities. And there's economics, and Senator Scott has mentioned several times about the money that's available to the state, that there might be millions of dollars that are available, and there might be. I don't know, at the same time though, I don't know what the economics are going to be in a project, a CCUS project on Dave Johnston to go from the plant to the oil field and what that looks like and which economics is better and which is better for the state of Wyoming. So I'm not really sure if this is, and then timing. And I think that there are others can speak to this more articulately than I can, but there are other sources of CO2 in the neighborhood able to deliver there that are closer to being economically and operationally viable than a CCUS project at Dave Johnston or another plant, just because we are trying to mature over a very short period of time a technology that is not mature. I mean, the only technology that's had success was Petronova. It was not able to stand on its own from an operationally or economic point of view. And there's probably all kinds of drivers in those economics and that operation, but every plant is also different. My understanding is that Petronova plant was a newer plant. Whether we're talking Dave Johnston or Jim Bridger, these plants are much older. And there's also the economics of what else could be put at those plants. We're looking at gas conversions at some of them that are more economic for customers. So there is 40 pages to this bill. It took the OCA and the commission and DEQ an hour of time last time to even try to understand what there is out. I've been looking at the bill for 2 months. I don't understand it. Don't know really what it means to me and my customers. And now we're going to amend it and put it in place. And I'm not sure what we're doing, and I'm not sure what the amendments do to fix what we're doing. So that's where the company's at. We will comply. We'll try to move forward if the bill moves forward. But, we strongly believe that, the better course of action to move forward with trying to get CCUS, because that is the goal, to get a CCUS project in Wyoming, is to run the processes that are in place, that the legislature put in place, to move that forward and hold the company accountable, let that run, figure out what we've learned from it, and then if there's more incentives or more accountability that needs to follow, that it comes from an informed piece of work, and that's where the company's at. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garlish, and thank you for coming up. You probably were coming here for the net metering discussion anyway, I would imagine.
Let Mr. Case into the metering conversation.
I'm just joking. All right, committee, any questions for Mr. Garlish? Down there, it's Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Garlish, you mentioned at least some mention of the 10th Circuit and some commitments that you've made there in a settlement. Could I just have an overview, just a quick summary of that? I don't need to go into details, but just why you think that interplays with this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garlish.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Case, Senator Barlow. I appreciate the question. So, the company has been aware of, the concern that's been expressed many times in the state about, the commitment to CCUS and commitment to the state. And as we were moving through, if you recall, like last year, Jim Bridger was going to be closed as a result of EPA action. And so to settle that case, we committed as part of the settlement to provide another layer of accountability for the company to pursue CCUS. So we put it in our settlement agreement with the EPA. It's not that the EPA wanted it in there or the environmentalists wanted it. The company put it in there because we wanted to have another piece of accountability to demonstrate that we were serious about moving this forward.
Okay. Senator Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the RFP process that you're currently going through, pursuant to our current laws. Just wonder if you could give a little bit more details where that's at, how many applications have you received, and just a little bit of a overview of what the timeline is for that process.
Mr. Garlish.
Sure. Some of it is under NDAs because some of the parties want to stay NDAs. So I'll do my best to give you the best, and if I can always supplement too. So generally where we're speaking is we had the initial round, we had the invitations, we got a batch of applicants, a good number of applications. And then, to move to the next stage, we had some questions. We lost some people when we asked them to produce some answers. And then last week had the mandatory walkthroughs of the plant. And we actually had to go back out. I want to make this point, we're actively managing folks. So as we work through the process, we're trying to balance between moving the process forward to show progress and forcing it to a conclusion, but being as open as we can in the process without losing people. So when folks have dropped out, we've sent emails, we've called them back and say, are you sure you don't want to play? And we've had some luck keeping some folks in. So we got a robust amount of participation. The exact number, I'll have to see if that's subject, but I can follow up on that. And so after the site view, I believe that we have that report due to the commission under their rules in late February, early March. We'll have all that information about where we are and what we have left to do. That's probably the best I can do off my top of my head. But I will say that the participation has been robust. There's been some criticism around our selection of the technology as being overly exclusionary. But from our perspective, we don't want to just do a project. If we're going to do a project, we want to do a project that's going to work, that's going to be operational, it's going to be financial, it's going to be good for customers, is actually going to happen. So we did the research. We had an army of analysts and engineers identify what were the things that in the projects that have moved forward, what did they have in common, what technologies did they use, what were the lessons learned, and we built the RFP requirements around things that were proven and that worked, because we wanted to balance the need to move forward quickly and trying to get to a place with a project, but also didn't want to use resources on things that didn't have a good chance of going forward. So trying to be balanced and fair about that, but you might have heard some of that criticism, so I just wanted to address it.
Thank you. Follow up?
I appreciate the answer. And along those lines, I think part of the reason why we're pushing this bill now is due to the retirement date set for Dave Johnson, which is rapidly approaching. And as we've discussed before, I think that creates a lot of awkwardness and the differences between the schedule of the legislature and your schedule. And so I'm wondering if that is still the plan to retire Dave Johnson in 2027, all the units or part of the units, if there's any update that you have along those lines, and if not, when can we expect a new timeline there?
Mr. Garlish?
So the IRP, those were the dates from the previous IRP. The new IRP won't be out until March, and as we sit here today, I don't know what it says. But what we're looking at Dave Johnson, which is the approach that we're trying to take within our regulatory construct of the 6 states in the IRP and all that, is, the infrastructure in Wyoming is incredibly valuable to us along with plants, and there is appreciable life and useful life of the plants and the materials around them, but the vision is to try to find, like we're doing in Kemmerer and like we're doing in Bridger, conversions to gas, conversions to nuclear, a CCUS project, something that can come after that makes sense for customers and makes sense for the state to use that infrastructure. So that's also come up, why aren't these things for sale if we don't want to use them? Well, they're not for sale because we're trying to figure out how we actually use the transition and the infrastructure for something else. But having, we are, as a regulated utility, I'm not in a position to just I don't run a real business. I just provide information to the people that really run the business, right? The commissions and the regulated utility. And so I have to work within the regulatory construct to find the projects that work. But that's what we're working towards and studying at all the sites.
Okay, coming this way, Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Garrish, I appreciate you being here. This is a tough catch up for all of us. But to go to the point that you just made, I guess I'm curious about where your company stands with regard to this opportunity to try something that I think it appears to me as a layperson that would be a benefit to Rocky Mountain Power, for example. If you could take home the fact that, hey, we're not only utilizing that product, but we are cleaning it up and using the byproduct. That's what intrigued me about this concept. Can you help me with some of that concern? Maybe reiterate for me what is the pushback there? Is it the aging plant itself, or is it the concept of utilization of that byproduct that doesn't quite get us there on renewable fronts? Or I hope that makes sense. Can you help me with that?
Chairman Case, Senator Landon, I think I understand, so I'll try, and you can correct me if I'm not quite getting there. So I don't think it's an issue whether or not the company sees potential in CCUS. I think there's potential in the technology. The challenge with it is the complexity of it. It's a new technology. It's an untried technology, and to the extent at commercial scale. So we have a big gap between what's available, on a bench test or a demonstration project and commercial scale. And there's several different types of technology. There's different CCUS technology that is out there, and some is even within that some of it is more advanced than others. So, so even when you have a new plant, a new coal plant, new gas plant that's going to create the CO2 for the new technology of the CCUS plant to be moved further down the road, all of that is new, and how it all works together is new. And maturing that technology overnight is a big step. And so as a utility company, we're not incentivized in our rate structure to be too innovative, frankly. It's supposed to be least cost, least risk, mature technologies, focused on reliable service at safe, at affordable prices. And so that's a challenge in and of itself. And these things are incredibly complicated, and from an operational and technical perspective when you're doing it all new. But then when you add the other layer of complexity of a retrofit, and I probably can't emphasize this enough, is you're taking that Model T and trying to put a Corvette turbocharger in there. And so it may not be that the Model T goes as fast as a Corvette. It might just go 40 miles an hour instead of 37 miles an hour when it runs. And trying to figure out what all that looks like is a challenge. So that's the utility side of it. the oil recovery side of it, that is not our business. And we haven't been in that business. There'll be a lot of hurdles for us to get in that business. So the lane we're seeing in is how do you take something and mature it overnight? And what's different from this situation as opposed to like our Kemmerer gas plant situation is our Kemmerer advanced nuclear plant. You have DOE money, you have Bill Gates money, taking all the technology risk, all the financial risk involved in the project, and I'm only buying the project at the end if it works and my customers are protected because there's a price cap. So that kind of structure fits within my regulatory kind of framework. Here, we don't have the same, we have some incentives from the state and the feds, but not to the same level as we do in the advanced nuclear. So we have something to work with, but not the same amount. And then trying to advance that technology and protect customers, their rates here in Wyoming and in our other states that we serve, is the bigger challenge on the CCUS side. And so it takes some time to figure out what that looks like and how that works. So I guess to come all the way around, it's not that this doesn't have potential. It's not that we're against it or trying to slow roll it. It's just, it takes time to mature a new technology, especially when you're working the regulatory constraints. And then a note about other states, because that's probably an elephant in the room. Like, and I can't, we have to, if our customers are taking a share and being served with it, their challenge with is not only carbon, but it's emissions in general. So the state policies in those other states, whether you agree with them or not, and I'm not going to try to defend other states and what they're doing, but their ratepayers, have a narrow view of what clean energy is and what clean coal looks like and what they're willing to pay for. So that's another part of the challenge.
Good. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, got two questions. One of them very simple. That's the first question. The process you're going through now, you had the request for proposal, or I think that's what you called it. When is that going to give you a finished product and what will the product tell you whether you can do or not?
Mr. Garlish.
So the next, I need some help with the dates. Do you remember when it closes? Do you guys remember when that closes? My first report is to you, but then what's the final date? 24, right? Yeah. So the HB 200 project ends in 24. But we have check-ins with the commission to hold us accountable on what we're doing and what we're learning all through there. So the commission's rules on that. So I think what you're getting at, Senator Scott, is this going to result in a project this year? And I'll just say no. But I don't know that this bill will result in a project this year either. I don't think it will.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, and the next question I've got to explain my model of what's going on here. You mentioned there were other sources of CO2. And Mr. Chairman, that's accurate. The other source that is known to be available is the Chute Creek plant of ExxonMobil on the LaBarge platform. And the CO2, all the CO2 that's now used in the state, Mr. Chairman, for advanced oil recovery is coming from that source. My understanding is that for the Glenrock, the Big Muddy field, to use that CO2, they've got a pipeline of some length, essentially from Midwest to the area just west of Glenrock there. I've heard 45 miles, but I'm not sure that's accurate. They may have to add compression to the pipeline between Chute Creek and Midwest to get the CO2 there. I'm told the pipeline does have the capacity, but you may have to add compression. Mr. Chairman, it's going to be relatively expensive. My understanding is that they will take over, Glenrock would take over a majority of the CO2 available from the expansion at LaBarge, at Chute Creek. And that will displace if it goes to Glen Rock, it will displace other uses that could occur in the state of Wyoming. Because the information I got from Enhanced Oil Recovery was that there were considerable other places. My question to you is, when you look at it from the potential customer's point of view, they need certainty in, is it going to be available or is it not? It looks to me like they're forced with a decision. I think the Chute Creek gas is going to find it's got quite a bit of market. They're in a position to speak for it now, and they may do so if they don't have certainty and ability to use CO2 from the Dave Johnson unit. Two related questions. If your study shows that you can in fact retrofit a carbon capture onto the Dave Johnson, and I'm pretty sure, Mr. Chairman, that it will, are you guys going to change the retirement date of the plant there? Or are you not, or have you not made that decision? And if it is to be retained and carbon capture installed, losing the primary customer because they jumped to another source because it was sure, what's that going to do to the prospects for it being economically successful? Because CO2 is expensive to transport.
Mr. Garlish,
Thank you, Chairman Casey.
have fun with that one.
Yeah, I'm not even sure who the primary customer is, but a couple of, I guess, observations. About the retirement date. There is a cease burning coal date and there's a retirement date. So if there is a project at Dave Johnson, whether it's a conversion to gas or a CCUS or advanced nuclear or something that the RFP shows up that there is something that we could basically use the infrastructure that's there, that's economic for customers, then I think that you have you have some flexibility on what happens at Dave Johnson in terms of the retirement date. And, I think we've seen that already looking at, like Bridger, where we've done conversions to, units 3 and 4 to natural gas to keep the plant and that area around it running. So there's that piece of it. There was a lot in your question, so I might wander around a little bit. So there is that piece of it. So I don't think it's a binary thing about what happens because of the IRP retirement date. The 200 project process is important to see if there is a CCUS project that makes, when I think of customers, I'm not thinking about, my customers are not the consumers of CO2. My customers are consumers of electricity. So when I'm looking at, what makes sense for my customers at Dave Johnson, no matter what the technology is it, can it go into rates and be recovered and meet the box of reliable and affordable? So, that is my business. The enhanced oil recovery piece of that, and, whether, this discussion of a business decision or a business deal and the economics of, I don't know the enhanced recovery business, it's not our business. But if Glen Rock or whoever has to make an economic decision, a business decision, which I think is theirs to make, about the certainty of supply today, about what's available, and then the certainty of a supply from a technology that isn't available, from a technology that isn't on the books yet, that seems like their business decision. And their customers and their investors need to make that decision for themselves about where they want to go with that. So I really don't know what to say about that. And then for the state of Wyoming, I would just note that if one Glen Rock project, I don't even want to talk about Glen Rock because I think it's bigger than that. If you're talking about maximizing Wyoming revenue with CO2, that seems like a separate discussion that could almost be an interim topic of itself about what incentives and disincentives and accountability should be in place for better use of the CO2 infrastructure that exists today to move that forward. So this is back to my opening comments. I guess I see these two things as not necessarily related. least from my perspective, because we're not in the CO2 business. We're not going to be in the CO2 business. It's not part of our business plan. We'd have to get all that approved by a commission.
Senator Scott, anything else?
Mr. Chairman, no, I think he's answered the question.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Garlish? Mr. Garlish, stay close by, okay?
We will do. Thanks. Appreciate the time.
Thank you. Who's next? Mr. Nelson, come on up. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Thor Nelson. I'm with the law firm of Holland and Hart. I appear today on behalf of the Wyoming Industrial Energy Consumers. Hopefully, you have in front of you the materials that we passed out at the last hearing and which were also emailed to you. I will be going through some of those materials and suggested amendments to the bill if this moves forward during the course of my testimony today. I'll start by just reminding the committee, which although you probably all know this, that WIAC is a coalition of large industrial energy consumers of Rocky Mountain Power. Collectively, the members of WIAC consume some 50% or so of the electricity sold by Rocky Mountain Power in the state of Wyoming. As a practical matter, I think it's important to start with the fact that WIAC supports the principle that Wyoming should fully explore and, where economically feasible, implement carbon capture and sequestration technologies at one or more retiring coal-fired facilities. And along those lines, WIAC worked actively on and supported both SF 159 and HB 200 as those pieces of legislation worked through the process over the last several years. WIAC has also been actively involved in the rulemakings that have been undertaken at the Commission regarding those pieces of legislation. And if you look at the statements of goals that Senator Scott and the sponsors of SF 142 have put in, WIAC supports those goals as a general principle. Having said that, as we look at the details of this very complex piece of legislation, we are concerned that there are some critical elements of the bill as introduced that will run counter to the objectives as articulated and will not do what we think the bill is trying to accomplish. As a result of that, we recommend that the committee consider moving this discussion to an interim study process. And that is not just because the bill is complicated. This legislature deals with complicated bills all the time. The issue that WIAC has is right now, we are not, from our perspective, in a very good position from an information perspective to know whether or not the SF 159 and HB 200 processes will work or not. Those processes were, I think, well thought out by the legislature, and the commission has done a very good job of implementing the rules. And right now, we are in the middle of the process trying to implement that. And our concern is if we create what I view as, in some respects, a conflicting process, maybe at best a process that runs in parallel, we run the risk of derailing the process that's already underway. And as was discussed by the prior witness from PacifiCorp, if we wait a little bit, I mean, I get that the legislature only meets once a year, but if you wait until next session, what I think you will have in front of you are several key pieces of information. We will have reports and analyses from the utilities relative to the RFPs. We will have an understanding of whether or not from those RFPs, it appears as though it will be likely that the existing systems will be sufficient to move forward with one or more carbon capture technologies. In the alternative, if it turns out that as a result of these RFPs and the reporting that PacifiCorp does, it determines that there is an impediment to the process moving forward, the information that the utilities will be providing to the commission will identify what those impediment may or may be with particularity, at which point then legislatively we could do, from our perspective, a much more surgical and focused fix to make sure that we are building constructively on SF 159 and HB 200 instead of undoing something before we know whether the basic thing works. So we think the timing of that works much better if we let the existing legislation get a little bit more developed, figure out whether this will work or not. And from WIAC's perspective, as we understand the timeline and as we look at the upcoming retirements for Dave Johnson and Jim Bridger, we believe that there is adequate time left to make sure that these goals are met before those retirements are scheduled to occur in 2027 and beyond. Now, having said that, if the committee and the legislature decides that you want to move forward, I do want to take a moment and identify two things. One is what we think the bill does that actually can work consistently with the existing legislation. And so there are 4 areas where I'd like to highlight, which I think can work, and then talk about another set of areas where I think these problems arise. And that's what I'm going to walk through in terms of the proposed amendments that WIAC has offered. First, I'll just mention on the plus side, and this isn't captured in the amendments because we're not trying to change everything. I will say that the concept that the commission should be proactive in making sure that the utility does not take actions as they operate these plants for the next few years that would create an impediment to the implementation of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So the notion that's in section 203 of the legislation, we think is positive. And just for your references, section 203 is on page 9, starting at line 1 of the bill. Having said that, relative to 203, as I mentioned in the materials that we passed out, right now the language in 203 is written as a penalty, that if the utility does something that makes it harder to do carbon capture, then penalties will kick in. My experience working with utilities is you're way better off trying to tell them what to do in advance instead of letting them do what they want and penalize them if you don't like it. And so I have proposed in the materials before you a proposed replacement section 203, which instead of prohibiting the act and putting in penalties, creates an affirmative obligation of the utility to develop a plan of how they will avoid causing problems with implementing CCUS on their coal-fired power plants, requiring the utility to make a report to the commission about how they're going to work to make that possible, and then giving the commission a chance to review and analyze that report. So that's right on page 2 of my little write-up relative to section 203. The other things that I talk about that are positive, I think that the bill does provide additional information to potential purchasers of coal-fired power plants to operate carbon capture and sequestration, and I'll talk about that quickly. We'll go through the edits, that there's a section that provides additional information, which I think could be valuable. There's also a section in the bill which contemplates the commission having a more affirmative role to review the outcomes of the RFPs and the bidding processes than was specifically articulated in HB 200, and I'll mention where that is, and I think that's a positive thing as well. And finally, I will say that I think that the Section 3 study that's contemplated, although as discussed in the last hearing, now shifting from DEQ to the commission, but the study to make sure that the decommissioning and remediation issues are understood and that we have sufficient monies set aside in the existing rate structure to pay for that and make sure that the utility pays for that. I think that is a reasonable effort to make sure that we're making sure that those remediation issues are fully addressed. Okay, so with that, let me now talk through though some of the areas where I think the legislation is potentially counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish. And if you look at my write-up on page 2, let me talk about section 204. Proposed section 204 is the section that relates to the decommissioning and reclamation bonds. And I guess I'll put it this way to be as clear as possible. If you do nothing else to this bill, please delete this section. We have spent a lot of time over the last several years analyzing the depreciation and decommissioning studies that PacifiCorp has filed periodically. They do so every 5 years. They update their depreciation decommissioning studies. We've analyzed those. The commissions have analyzed those, not just in this state, but in every one of the 6 states that PacifiCorp operates. They have analyzed these decommissioning studies because, remember, it's not just Wyoming customers, it's all of the customers at PacifiCorp who are on the hook if these remediation issues are not fully paid for, essentially, in the rates that are charged to customers. And so we are both highly confident that the estimates are good as best as we can make it, although as I said, doing the additional study can't hurt. But what we do know or believe very strongly is that creating this bond that is contemplated in the statute is over the top unnecessary. And I estimate, based on our experience, although this is just a guess, But based on what we've seen in terms of the cost of bonds and the elements here, we could be talking about something in the $40 to $50 million range, just in terms of the cost of securing the bond. I also believe that because the other states think that their process is sufficient and that this bonding is unnecessary, I think it's very likely that in the multi-state process, which we'll talk about a couple of times today, in the multi-state process, the other states will determine that this is a Wyoming-specific initiative and will charge the cost of this bond entirely to Wyoming ratepayers. And all of that risk, from our perspective, is unnecessary. We have a process in place, and that process is working and should be relied upon. I will say, in the italicized language at the bottom of page 2 of my write-up, I had suggested that you could add to the decommissioning bonding process, get rid of that, but you could instead have a commission study. Now, that commission study has largely been made moot because with the edits to section 3, the commission is already doing a study. But I will highlight if you look at the 4th line on the last paragraph of page 2 on my write-up, there is a clause which is maybe worth adding to the new section 3, and that is where it says, and whether the utility has a clearly articulated plan to pay for all of the actual decommissioning and remediation expenses associated with the retirement of any Wyoming coal-fired electric generation facility. If you look at the way section 3 is written, it's focused on identifying what the costs are, but it doesn't actually also add in the question of, and do we make sure that we can pay for it? Which I think is the guts of the Senator Scott's and the other sponsors' concern. And so I would respectfully consider taking that clause and adding it into the section 3 now as amended to reflect what the commission is doing. All right, with that, let me turn to section 205. And this is on page 3 of my write-up. Section 205 is on page 19 of the legislation, and it runs for about 9 pages. There are 2 main issues with section 205. One of the main issues, which the commission has already discussed in its comments, is that it's a little bit confusing to a lot confusing exactly how the proposed process here overlays with, complements with, is run in parallel with the SF 159 and HB 200 process. And so a lot of the elements of section 205 appear to be repetitive. Having said that, the one piece which is clearly not repetitive, but which creates a significant problem, is the notion that a sale will be triggered if the output of a power plant is reduced to below 35% of that power plant's operating characteristics. And here's the problem I see with that. As Senator Scott mentioned in his opening remarks introducing the bill, one of the elements which is tied into this section is an idea that the commission will evaluate the sale, and there was a discussion of making sure that if there is a sale, it's at least done for minimum salvage value, because a sale like that mandated by statute is a legislative taking, and so you want to make sure that the person whose property has been taken is compensated. From my perspective, that methodology and that thought process may make sense in the context of a power plant that is retired or shut down. The problem with applying that concept to a power plant that is still running, albeit only running at maybe a third of its capacity, is that 5 other states have a stake in that power plant's output, albeit at a third of its capacity, and they will not be satisfied in a takings claim with only net salvage because they're still using the plant. They may not be using it 100%, but they're still using it, and they're paying to use it. And so if you trigger a sale before the other states have affirmatively exited and the plant has been shut down for their purposes, there will be a takings, and the price of that takings will be whatever is necessary to replace that power for all the other states. And all of that bill will come squarely to Wyoming ratepayers. And so from WYAC's perspective, the idea of an output reduction trigger is very dangerous in the context of remembering that these power plants serve and are paid for by customers in 6 different states, not just Wyoming. And so we don't have the ability to just decide that's not running enough, let's go ahead and shut it down without bearing potentially significant cost consequences from that. So from our perspective, if you're going to keep 205 and you don't decide that it's inconsistent with 200 and 159, which I think it is, at a minimum, you need to get rid of the output reduction element, because I think you will create lots of unintended consequences potentially, and potentially create costs. Now, having said that, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are portions of the process that we think are improvement. And if you look at the italicized language in kind of the middle of page 3 of the write-up, section 3718.205D, E, and H, which you can find, D and E are on page 21 of the bill, H is on page 25. Those are the 3 sections that we think do sort of complement and work with 159 and 200, although I would suggest just logistically, if you get rid of the rest of the stuff, it would be perfectly appropriate, as I mentioned here, to move those sections into 37.3.117, which is the area where 159 exists in statute, so that it clearly becomes part of that existing process and not something that is potentially contradictory or duplicative. All right. Section 206 on page 28 of the bill. This is the next sort of big picture question. And I'll say that this really applies to 206 and 207 on page 31. Those 2 sections deal with the new idea of injecting PSC regulation into the sale of carbon dioxide from a power plant. Now, interestingly, and just as a preface to this, much of the rest of the bill is structured with the idea that the power plant is sold to someone else other than the utility, who then operates it with the purpose of selling the carbon dioxide. This section is different. This section is written with the idea that the utility retains the power plant and keeps operating it. And in that instance, there is this fallback that if the utility and the carbon dioxide customers are unable to reach an agreement as to the sale of that carbon dioxide, there's a role for the commission then to step in and set by commission rate-making process the rates for the sale of the carbon dioxide from the utility, PacifiCorp, to the carbon dioxide customer. This is outside of the scope of what the commission has done historically, obviously. The commission, by Wyoming statute, regulates public utilities. There is no indication in this statute that we're going to declare people who sell carbon dioxide to be engaged in a sale of a public utility commodity. Public utility commodities ordinarily are thought of as electricity, natural gas, water, telephone service, sort of, before it got deregulated. But carbon dioxide has never been a utility product. And so the commission has never regulated that. And this legislation doesn't propose to make all sales of carbon dioxide regulated, only the sale from a public utility for electricity to a customer. Meaning, in the illustration that Senator Scott had with Mr. Garlish earlier, that if you're sitting there in Big Muddy and you are looking to buy carbon dioxide, you will have 2 choices, potentially. You will have a regulated sale at a price set by the commission from somebody operating the power plant and selling carbon dioxide, or a free market unregulated sale from someone like Exxon. Meaning that you created a system here where a commission-regulated product will directly compete with a private sector supplier. And that's, from WIAC's perspective, poor public policy. As a general principle, our recommendation is if you're going to regulate a utility service, you need to regulate all of the people who are doing that so that everyone's on a level playing field. If a particular commodity is not a public utility service, then the free market should reign. But setting up a situation where you have one regulated sale competing with an unregulated sale is a dangerous precedent, and one that we think is ill-advised to go down. So from our perspective, we would encourage you to be very cautious about extending the commission's role in regulation to what is currently an unregulated market. That is, the sale of carbon dioxide is an unregulated market today. And before you add a level of regulation to a portion of that market, we think you should be very cautious, because that has the potential to create all sorts of unintended consequences. All right. Section 208 is sort of the next piece of the puzzle, if you would. This is on our write-up on page 4. This relates to the role of CCUS, in the context of reliability issues or concerns. From our perspective, as we look through it, and again, consistent with where the commission has gone, this looks largely duplicative with or redundant with the existing protections in 159 and 200. And so we're not sure what exactly this does that those laws don't already accomplish. The big exception to this is section 3718 208A little 2I. That is new and different. And that actually is, I think, a good idea in that it creates the additional opportunity for someone who buys a retiring power plant and uses it to provide carbon dioxide through CCUS. It provides additional opportunities for them to sell the electric output of that facility under different situations. And so in that context, that actually is additive from our perspective to SF 159 and HB 200. And so that part makes sense to keep. Although again, consider moving that into the 37.3.117 as part of that process so that it's clear that it is consistent. On the bottom of page 4, we talk about section 209. This is a strange piece of the law. As I read it, I'm not 100% sure what it's getting at. If you look at the top of page 5 of our write-up, we've replicated the section. It talks about an agreement between a public utility who sells a facility and a purchaser of the facility for the purchaser to profit share with the utility from whom they bought the plant, which is an economic model that frankly I'd never heard anybody talk about in the context of 159 or 200. But maybe that's a thing. But the issue here is that it says if they do that, there's language which is shown in strikeout, because I proposed to edit that says that those revenues back to the utility shall be available to satisfy any recovery of stranded costs that would otherwise be recovered from the public utilities customers. I have no idea what that's referring to. I have no idea why we think we have stranded costs. Stranded costs normally are costs that are unpaid for by the utility because of a change in an action like a premature retirement of a plant or something like that. In this context, 100% of all these costs of these plants are being paid for. Nothing is being stranded. And so I don't know what that means. And so I just suggest by way of alternative, if you want to try to capture those revenues and make sure that they are used to offset customer rates, probably better to say as revenues that will offset the utilities' Wyoming revenue requirements. That will then clearly make sure that the monies that the utility gets back from a profit sharing will be used to offset rates, which I think is the bill's intent. All right, and then last but not least, there are a number of other sections that I think are generally fine, subject to whether they relate to things that still exist. And again, I'll just highlight section 3, which we do think having some further study and analysis to make sure that we are capturing, and then, like I said in the very beginning, have mechanisms to pay for the remediation costs. That's good, and we can certainly do that because issues are changing, and so additional study is fine. And then the last thing I'll just mention is section 4. Section 4 is the discussion of asking the OCA to engage in a process to analyze whether the utilities are basically doing what they're supposed to do relative to the sale of carbon, and if not, to recommend rate reductions. I will say that my entire professional life has been spent as a utility consumer advocate, and previously in the state context, now in the private sector context, and I will just confess to you, I have no idea how I would do that sort of study. That kind of analysis of sort of this but-for case is very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to know what sort of the alternative would look like and then how to put that into rates. Very difficult to do. Having said that, Mr. O'Nellis, very smart guy. And so obviously if you want to do that sort of analysis, he's a guy who can get that done. But I will note, I do think that will cost money. because that is a complicated piece of analysis. And so I know that that office is strapped, and I would just hope that the legislature sees fit to make sure that that office has the resources necessary to do that job if you want to give it to him. So those are our comments on the bill. I appreciate the time to allow me to walk through our specific proposals, and happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman, by yourself or the members of the committee.
Anybody have questions? I think you got off easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, who's next? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of your, this section is fine, number 10, is the modification to House Bill 200. Just saying we're going to look at CCUS in the context of that. Do you think that actually could be used to accomplish everything that the entire bill does? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nelson, did you catch that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barlow, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that, in fact, I think that the reason why I suggested that from WIAC's perspective, that section is because it is, in fact, sort of consistent with where we've been headed. And I agree that that could be a platform to address lots of these issues. And as a general principle, I think it is value added for the legislature to express its intent as to how these objectives ought to be met, and to express its intent both to the utilities in the state and to the regulators. I think in this context, the less specific you can be about that, and the more discretion and flexibility you can give to the regulators and the utilities involved in the process to make it work, the better.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Who's next?
Thank you.
Who else would like to address the committee? Ms. Lee? You're not alone. Welcome. Ms. Lee, we'll go with you, and
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
welcome to make any introductions or what you're working on.
All right, thank you. I'm here today joined with Mr. Wally Wolski, and I think Mr. Matt Cooney, the CFO of Glenrock Energy, might be on the Zoom, but thank you. So good afternoon. My name's Kristen Lee, and I represent Glenrock Energy, and we're here today to support Senate File 142. And we appreciate your time and your effort in looking at this bill. And with the indulgence of the committee, I'm reminded that back in 1995, Wyoming was on the cutting edge. It was on the forefront of legislating changes to the telecommunications industry. Wyoming legislated sweeping regulatory shift in telecom policy, and Wyoming was ahead of Congress in enacting the 1996 Act. Senate File 142 is a regulatory shift, and it's a big shift. But it's a shift that's needed because the bill addresses the energy transition that is taking place in Wyoming right now. The bill addresses carbon capture, which is critical to Wyoming's energy future, and it involves the commission because utilities are investor-owned but provide a public service. And during this energy transition, Wyoming has the same opportunity to lead in carbon capture, lead in achieving a private sector solution that's not funded by the ratepayers, and lead in producing a stable, low-carbon, and affordable supply of electricity. And I'll stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Ms. Lee? I think you're good. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Wally Wolski, and though both of us are affiliated with Glenrock Energy, we come before you this afternoon also as citizens of Wyoming to share our thoughts on disabling legislation that is vitally important for facilitating a private sector solution for the development of carbon capture opportunities, which protects the public interest. Let me begin by saying Glenrock Energy is a Wyoming-based oil production and carbon management company, which has been focused on carbon capture as a Wyoming-centric opportunity for the past 6 years. As a Wyoming oil producer with state leases comprising over 60% of its total acreage, Glenrock Energy knows well the financial benefits to Wyoming of developing stranded oil, as well as the need for securing reliable supplies of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Enhanced oil recovery will provide huge financial benefits for both oil producers and the state of Wyoming. Based on an analysis prepared by the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, Wyoming has multiple established oil fields located within a 25-mile radius of 3 existing coal-fired power plants containing 297 million barrels of stranded oil producible through CO2 injection, which could provide $2.7 billion of additional tax revenue for the state and county governments over the next 20 years. Wyoming has an abundance of coal as well as an opportunity to retrofit existing coal-fired generation units with carbon capture. CO2 is not a waste product. Rather, it's a valuable commodity. For example, CO2 is currently in high demand among oil producers throughout the state. In particular, the Dave Johnston Power Plant near the town of Glenrock is located within 6 miles of the Muddy Glenrock oil fields, which has over 90 million barrels alone of stranded producible oil through CO2 injection that could provide $1.2 billion in additional tax revenue to the state and local county governments over the next 20 years. Senate File 142 reflects an appreciation of Wyoming's abundant coal and oil industries and their continued economic importance for our state's economy. Too often, the national media portrays coal and oil as having no place in the energy transition. We know that is false because energy produced from coal can be cleanly consumed when it is complemented with carbon capture, which has been proven at scale. In addition, oil consumption will continue to be in demand for decades to come. Combining carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery reduces net emissions of such oil by up to 63%. Senate File 142 provides regulatory authority and a roadmap for situations when an investor-owned utility is unable or unwilling to implement carbon capture on its coal-fired units. It provides a pathway for private sector, non-utility companies to retrofit those units with proven technology, capturing and transforming CO2 into a valuable commodity. This bill preserves existing coal-fired power plants and their benefits as part of an ongoing transition to a low-carbon economy. Senate File 142 unlocks the value of the existing coal-fired fleet by affording the private sector a level playing field and necessary framework to proceed forward and preserving sustainable, dispatchable, and reliable 24/7, 365 baseload generation. This private sector approach enhances the intent of both 159 and 200. The federal government has incentivized carbon capture adoption with 45Q tax credits. As a result, retrofitting coal-fired power plants is profitable, long-term business that can provide our state with both immense fiscal benefits and environmental stewardship. More importantly, the cost of installing and operating carbon capture equipment will be funded with private investment, supported by tax credits, and in certain cases, revenue from carbon dioxide sale to oil producers. Once again, the cost of installation and operation of carbon capture will not be passed along to rate-paying consumers. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we acknowledge that Senate File 142 is complex legislation. However, it is very important to point out a few of its associated positive benefits. First, carbon capture helps eliminate the release of greenhouse gases. Second, it avoids early retirement of existing coal-fired plants. Third, it extends coal's role as a valuable natural resource. Fourth, it expands oil development in legacy fields. Fifth, it improves grid reliability. Sixth, it builds upon Wyoming's dominance as a national energy leader. Seventh, it provides resilient backup for interruptible renewable power. Eighth, it fulfills and enhances the intentions of prior legislation which addressed retrofitting units with carbon capture technology without impacting consumer rates. And last but not least, Senate File 142 unlocks billions of dollars in new state revenues. Complex legislation with huge rewards. The window of opportunity for Wyoming will not exist indefinitely. Now is the time to take action for achieving the multitude of benefits associated with implementation of carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery on behalf of the best interest of the state of Wyoming and the general public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This concludes my prepared testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Walsky. Who would like to ask any questions of Mr. Walsky? Nobody? Thank you, Mr. Walsky. Thank you, Ms. Lee. Who's next?
Thank you.
Who else would like to address the committee? Is there anybody online? Let's hear it. Let them both in, you bet. Ms. Anderson, can you unmute, address the committee?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. Also speaking on behalf of the Wyoming Association of Ratepayers, which is a project of our organization that we've got involved in over the last few years as we've worked these bills that you all have implemented. It's really difficult to follow Mr. Nelson, so I will try and keep this brief and just kind of reiterate and emphasize a few points that were made and maybe add a few additional ones. The first is, as you all know, I did send you an email last week about the bonding provisions of the bill. And for all the reasons Mr. Nelson and Mr. Petrie and Mr. Parfit laid out to you, we would really encourage you to take that provision out of the bill. We have grave concerns about particularly the Environmental Quality Council role, the right to petition, the administrative appeal process, and who decides bonding amounts and why. And this all amounts to additional costs that customers would have to pay. We appreciate that you've tried to insulate ratepayers from these extra costs, but as Chairman Petrie explained, that's simply not possible. If state policy makes the utility incur costs, those utilities have a right to recover the costs. And as was mentioned earlier, under our multi-state agreement that we have regarding our largest utility on costs, those costs are only recovered from Wyoming ratepayers. A choice of policy in Wyoming is allocated only to Wyoming ratepayers. I think there's an assumption in the bill that somehow other states will come on board if we pass this bill and if we get CCS going. I would note, and you know this, Mr. Chairman, that Oregon doesn't have a CO2 standard bill. They have a no coal standard. It's no coal in rates by 2030. They're not going to come back to us. And I think it's important as a state to think forward for Wyoming and our state and our customers and not so much focus on what could be attractive to other states going forward. I'd like to also emphasize the point about economic dispatch and capacity factors, must-run requirements, the EIM. All of this is incredibly complicated, and we just urge you to really tread carefully as you move forward, given that all of that could come back an additional cost for Wyoming customers. I would also note that there's the definition of closure in the bill is very concerning. You may remember House Bill 160 166, which we haven't talked about as one of these bills, from a couple of years ago, the 2021 session, sponsored by then Speaker Barlow, which had a very good definition of closure in it, and it specifically exempted units that are required for closure because of environmental compliance obligations. And that's in particular, Dave Johnson Unit 3 has that in place. Other units may as well. So if we don't exempt those kind of units from this bill, that could actually bring us into non-compliance with environmental primacy issues with EPA and DEQ, Clean Air Act issues. It was also mentioned, of course, that there's some interest in converting Jim Bridger units 1 and 2 to natural gas. There's no exemptions or exceptions for conversion in this bill, which again could run afoul of EPA requirements related to those particular units. And also, speaking of environmental compliance, I think it's important to remember that Dave Johnson 4 doesn't have SCR. There's currently not a requirement for SCR at Dave Johnson 4, but it's probably needed for carbon capture at that unit. Again, those are going to be additional costs that will be passed on to ratepayers in Wyoming. We're looking at $1 billion project potentially for the carbon capture piece of Dave Johnson 4. So just as was previously mentioned, we really believe that the bills that had been passed previously, House Bill 166, Senate File 159, House Bill 200, they're working as intended. There's been extensive rulemaking at the Public Service Commission to implement those laws. Those regulations have balanced the burdens and the benefits. They've really taken to stakeholder feedback and comments. Our organization has been involved in rulemaking for several years now. We've been involved in the implementation process as cases have now come before the commission to implement House Bill 200. So we just really urge you to kind of let that process play out, and really to let the negotiations between these two companies play out, and to not force a deal with improper state authority, which is essentially what this bill does. We understand there may be a disagreement between the utility and Glenrock. There's various reasons why a deal hasn't been reached yet, but we don't believe the state should interfere in that private negotiation. Just as today in the news, there was news in North Dakota that some negotiations have fell apart between Basin Electric and a potential carbon capture hydrogen company up there. So there's many reasons why negotiations fall through, why deals aren't made, and really that's the private sector, and it's not the state's role. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions. We really appreciate your time. And we know that this is complicated law, but we really do urge you to walk carefully.
Okay, committee questions for Ms. Anderson. Any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. And who else is online, sir? I didn't catch your name.
Yes, good
Ron
afternoon.
Smith?
Yes,
Mr. Smith, go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking as a private citizen living in Powell. I'm speaking against SF 142. I'm a process engineer with an MBA and 45 years of experience in the energy industry. And while I could take issue with many of the details of the bill, in the interest of time, I'll just focus on the bigger picture. First, it seems like SF 142 is an admission that the already implemented HB 200 is not working, despite considerable effort and money expended by the PSC, Rocky Mountain Power, and Black Hills Energy. So it seems to me, instead of facing economic reality, we're reaching for a bigger hammer. No doubt that subsidies can help overcome market resistance and push promising carbon capture technologies toward commercialization. As you know, federal incentives have expanded greatly the last 2 years. But as Wyoming Utilities recently demonstrated, it is still premature to mandate carbon capture technology for coal power plants. The General Accounting Office recently released a report concluding that carbon capture technologies are mature in some sectors, but require further demonstration in other sectors like power generation, which is specifically mentioned. Demonstration is different than a mandated commercial plant. I'm all for coal technology research and have participated in several projects myself over the last 30 years. There are dozens of carbon capture technologies currently targeting coal-fired power plants that have attracted billions in public and private investment. Why are there so many? Because no one has hit a home run yet. I believe it's too early for the legislature to pick a winner and force a costly scale up, especially when it could pass the risk on to utilities, their shareholders, and ratepayers. SF 142 favors the power plant purchaser by assigning legal and financial risk to all of the parties to the transactions. It protects the buyer from the selling utility on one hand and from the CO2 customer on the other. Moreover, by restricting eligibility to very specific criteria, it appears to shield a particular buyer from its would-be competitors. In conclusion, SF 142 decrees that CCUS serves the public interest. I would ask which public and on what grounds? What obstacles would this particular provision surmount? I could argue that society benefits more from power generated by natural gas combined cycle than from coal CCUS. Even without carbon capture, natural gas achieves comparable CO2 emission reductions and affords greater grid reliability at a small fraction of the cost. I appreciate your time and would answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Questions for Mr. Smith? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Anybody else online? Mr. Schwartz. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Case, members of the committee. I'm Robert Short, County Commissioner in Converse. And I'd like to thank Senator Scott for his work on this bill. This very important issue facing Commerce County is associated with the employment, the economic stability, as well as obviously the grid stability that we experience from a coal-fired power fleet. We understand that there are a multitude of regulatory issues that these public utilities face. We understand that there are environmental issues that are being pressuring all of these folks. We urge the legislature to continue your work on this very important issue so that we can hopefully maintain a reliable, robust grid and as well retain good paying jobs in a small community of Glen Rock. I thank you all for your time and would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Questions for Commissioner Schwartz? Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else wish to testify to the committee? Anybody else? Not seeing.
I have a set of amendments here that I've had the LSO worked up in proposed amendment form. Did them over the weekend and they've got those ready to go. What the amendments do is eliminate all the bonding references. Keep the study and the studies that are in there. Keep a few other little provisions, but eliminate all the bonding provisions in that section. That eliminates one of the major sources of complaint we've had in the bill. And frankly, I wrote those, put them in instantly upon hearing that there was a major problem there. Hearing from sources I felt was very reliable. Talking to DEQ and Public Service Commission since then, I've been reassured that the magnitude of the problem is probably not what we thought. And I think we have some time to get the studies done before we think about the bonding or other creative ways to deal with the problem if there's a shortfall. I've got another set of amendments, There's just a technical LSO catch on one section. They said subsection where they should have said section. Just mistaken in referencing things.
So,
There is a set of Public Service Commission recommendations that I have that I think are mostly good, although I would quarrel with some of them. And so I think a little time I can put together an amendment that'll solve many of the problems. And that depends how you want to manage the committee, Mr. Chairman.
well, let's talk about that, everybody. I'm glad we got through public testimony today. This is the last week for bills. You know, we've got other things in the heavy committee, so if we want to take a couple more noon meetings or one more noon meeting, do you think we could do it in one more?
One more.
And could we do it? We've been having success on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but, you know, we're going to finish all our bills on Thursday, I hope. And so I would like to give, since the Public Service Commission came up with their amendments, I'd like them to be able to present their amendments rather than just have, you know, us kind of adopt them. So Senator Scott, I'll let you pick. Can we go take it back up on Thursday at 12:30? I think tomorrow is an option, but I don't know about the other members of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, if I could weigh in. So the number, and I've reviewed and worked in the Public Service Commission's amendments. I've seen where some of the other amendments that are suggested of them. I have not worked in Senator Scott's bondings, but if it's a complete strike out of 5 pages, I'm good with that.
I like that too.
I guess.
Gives me 5 things to be happy about.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me.
He said he's not quite finished.
I guess what I would, maybe if there's a way, it seems like this bill is going to have so many changes that we're almost in with a substitute bill. And so, and it doesn't mean it has to be, but depends on the substantiveness of all of it put together. So if there's a way to synthesize everything into a document that then we, as a committee on Thursday, can step through and say, this is what we need, this is what we don't need, this is what we need. Senator Scott and the presenters can make their case about each specific point. Maybe it's not a substitute bill, but some kind of a working document so we can actually end up, so when we go to the floor, I mean, this is going to be a substantial amendment for our staff to put together on Thursday to be heard. Monday's the last day, committee of the whole.
Right.
So I mean, I want us to get the best product we can to take to the floor if we're going to take it to the floor. And there seems to be quite a bit of work to be done. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, and Senator Scott, looking at you, it seems to me that it's going to take a little while to put this all together. And that's why I'm thinking Thursday would be a better time. But I'm not opposed to working tomorrow at noon if you wish, or at 12:30, but
Mr. Chairman,
I'm not convinced this bill will pass the committee, but we'll find out. Go ahead, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I would have preferred tomorrow, but I think I can get a compromise in most of the amendments and have a worked out compromise to bring the committee and make it easier for a lot of the things.
Yeah,
There may be a few points where there's not. I think Thursday may be safer than.
all right.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, that the substitute bill may have time trouble, that idea.
So, you know, everybody's been discouraging substitute bills, so, I prefer we don't go down that road, but I understand the difficulty. So, Senator Scott, we'll come back here at 12:30 on Thursday. We're not going to take any new public testimony. Today was your chance on that. But I do want to hear, as we plow through amendments, we'll certainly take the input at that time. Okay? Thank you, everybody, and Rocky Mountain Power just ought to move their headquarters here because this is the center of the universe. All right, thank you very much, everybody.